I am coming to you from a very hot and humid Manaus in the Brazilian Amazon, and I am about to embark on the journey of, possibly the journey of this trip, possibly the journey of a lifetime. I'm about to embark on a boat down the Amazon River to the Atlantic Ocean. Are you ready? I am. Let's go. Hey everyone, I'm Tim, and I've just finished a 9-month odyssey around Latin America. Now I'm reopening my diaries, and this time I'm bringing you along with me. Week by week, country by country, all the colors, all the craziness, all the food, all the music, and all the splendor. 9 months when each morning was a new adventure. The road was my companion, and Latin America cast its spell on me. This is my Latin America Diaries. Welcome back to Latin America Diaries, and welcome to Brazil. I flew from Bogota with Avianca Airlines through the night to the city of Manaus in the center of Brazil's Amazon region. Manaus is a surprisingly big city of over 2 million people on the banks of the Amazon River, deep in the Amazon rainforest. Although you wouldn't know it, because walking around Manaus, it feels just like any other major built-up city. There is some really gorgeous old architecture though, and across the road from the Airbnb where I was staying, there was this beautiful Amazon theater. One night, I saw a man playing the violin out the front of it. That was on my first night in Manaus, and it was clear that I was having the complete Brazil experience from day one. The next morning, I set off into the city center of Manaus to organize my cruise. Stay tuned if you want to find out how I did that and how it worked out. But in the meantime, please like my video, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to make sure that you are updated every time I upload a new video from this series. And if you like what you're seeing, please share my content and tell your family and friends about it. It really means a lot to me, and it helps me grow this YouTube channel. Walking around the center of Manaus, I really began to appreciate how different Brazil was from Colombia. And that's saying something, because this really was just my first day and my first city in Brazil. Colombia, by contrast, felt more similar to Mexico, obviously beyond just the language being the same language. But I guess Colombia also felt more quintessentially South American, whereas Brazil from the very beginning felt like a complete world away from everywhere that I had visited so far, and I loved it. I walked down towards the center of Manaus, and I stopped in at a shop which was selling tropical fruit shakes. After all, I was in the Amazon. And just as if to prove the point that I was in the middle of a rainforest, it began to absolutely pour with rain. Further along, I stopped in and got a shaved turkey breast and cheese toasted sandwich, which seems to be quite a thing in this part of the world. And then I continued down to the dock where I would organize my cruise. Before I could even get to the dock, I was approached by one of the ticket sellers that stand out on the street. And I was a little bit concerned that it mightn't have been legitimate, so I booked with him, but before handing over money, made sure that he took me right up to the main company counter inside the terminal, just to sort of verify it. Apparently there was some kind of benefit to booking with an agent as opposed to booking directly with the office. I think it might have been a bit cheaper or something, but I think there was also like a disclaimer that if the ship was overloaded, that you would be the first to be bumped off or something. But regardless, it was all above board, and I got my ticket. Because I was booking my ticket within 24 hours of departure, the agent was also able to get me checked in for the trip rather than the next morning, because apparently that process is quite time consuming. There's usually a long line to check in and board the boat on the morning of the departure. I then went to buy a Brazilian SIM card, which proved more difficult than I had expected. And then I went to get a haircut at a place down a side street where I met a Venezuelan barber who was working there. And it was great to be able to speak Spanish with him, because up until that point, since I had arrived in Brazil, I had really been struggling with Portuguese. And I know a lot of people say that the two languages are very similar, but I had been doing Portuguese on Duolingo for 2.5 months, or maybe 3 months, before I arrived in Brazil, and was hoping that I would be able to piggyback off the back of my Spanish that I could speak at a sort of pre-intermediate, intermediate level at that point. A lot of people say that these languages are mutually intelligible, but I disagree. I found Portuguese very difficult, actually. Perhaps Portuguese is more easily understandable if you speak Spanish as a first language, but Spanish was my third language and I found Portuguese quite different. I also went shopping for a hammock that day because I knew that the type of ticket that I had bought for the ferry required me to bring along my own bedding. And I had confirmed that with the ticket agent, and so off I went to a small hammock and fabric market, which is across the road and just down a bit from the dock itself. The hammocks seem to range in price from like $15 American up to $70 American, depending on the fabric and the durability and the size of it and the comfort. I got one from memory that was about 30 or 40 Australian, so that would be about $25 American, and it worked just fine for the 5 days that I needed it. I headed back to my Airbnb to get some rest before the trip, which would depart the next morning, but not before I went out for dinner at an Amazonian Brazilian restaurant across the road where I tried a local soup called tacacá. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of that, by the way. It's made with a bunch of different herbs and spices and like green leaves, which are often found in the local region. And one of those, at least one of those spices or green leaves, it actually has sort of like a numbing effect on your tongue. And so I didn't particularly like that. It was quite a strange sensation, but I had a laugh about it with the waiter afterwards because I, through my very broken Portuguese, was able to sort of explain that it was a strange feeling. And he kind of looked at me and said something to the effect of, "Oh my God, is this your first time tasting it?" And I said yes. And he was like, "Oh, yeah, that like, yes, you know, did you like it?" So we both kind of laughed about it. The next morning, bright and early, I woke up, checked out of the Airbnb and headed down to the dock with my hammock. I made my way past the ticket office and out onto the wharf, and that was where the instructions ran out because I had to search for the boat myself. At one point I saw a boat which I thought was the one that I was booked onto, and it was carrying the flag of the occupying force in Palestine.
We've just arrived at the port, and there's this boat here which everyone was pointing me towards, but it has that flag on there, and I'm really hoping that this is not the boat that I'm going to be on. Okay, so I have just been told actually that it's this boat here, which is great because it's actually a much bigger boat as well, so hopefully it's like a double win.
Made my way over there, boarded, checked in, and then made my way up to the deck where I would be staying. So let me set the scene for you. Manaus is a city built on the Amazon River, about 1,500 kilometers upstream from the mouth of the Amazon on the Atlantic coast. The Amazon is a huge river. It is incredibly wide, and it has about 1,100 major tributaries and many smaller creeks that run into it, of course. As a result, the river is almost like a sea in itself. In fact, some locals even refer to the Amazon River as the Amazon Sea because it is so wide and so deep in parts. Because of this, the river really acts as an important lifeline for the region. It's almost like a maritime highway, you could say. And although Manaus is 1,500 kilometers from the coast, it doesn't feel like that because the river is so wide and deep at that point that it accepts ships, tankers, cruise liners, all this way inland. Think of the Amazon River as this vast highway that slices through the Amazon rainforest, and it becomes clear why communities along the river need to be linked this way by ferry. Many of them aren't connected by road because of the rainforest and the sheer scale of the river system. As a result, boats run regularly up and down different sections of the river. Twice a week, ferries depart Manaus and make their way all the way to Belém at the mouth of the Amazon on the Atlantic coast. The journey takes about 4 complete days downstream from Manaus to Belém. That was, in my case, from Wednesday morning until Sunday morning. So 4 complete days, but over the course of 5 days. The journey takes about 6 or 7 days going upstream because of the current. These boats aren't fancy. They operate as working ferries, ferrying people from river ports to major centers along the way. Most people aren't traveling the entire distance. Most passengers on the boat will board or disembark at one of the intermediate stops. However, for backpackers in South America, this ferry has sort of become something of a rite of passage, so obviously I had to do it. On board, the ferry has a bar upstairs and a galley downstairs. There was clean water provided on the boat as well, with a water filter where you could refill your bottles. There are 2 accommodation options. You can stay on the main deck where you bring your own sleeping setup, usually a hammock, or you can book a private cabin with air conditioning. However, most of the private cabins don't have outward-facing windows. And really, a big part of why people and myself take a trip like this is to experience life on the river, to be out of the cabin, on the deck, in the fresh air, and watching life on the Amazon go by. You get to meet people as they board and disembark at the several ports along the way. On top of all of this, it's just a more economical option anyway. So in my case, it made perfect sense to be in the hammock. If you do want to see the Amazon in style, then it's absolutely possible. As I mentioned, Manaus is actually a deep water port, and luxury cruise liners do make it all the way up to Manaus if that's your style. However, it just wasn't my style and really in my budget for this trip. So I boarded the ship and I climbed up to the 2nd level deck, where I was standing there trying to figure out how to hoist my hammock when one of the ship's staff came along and very kindly offered to do it for me. So off I went. After getting everything set up and getting settled in, I probably had to wait on the boat for about another 1.5 hours before we actually pulled out of port. I had been told to be there for departure at 10 o'clock, but in fact the ferry left at 11:30, and that hour and a half consisted of cargo and people being loaded onto the boat while I stood there and watched. If you're planning to take this trip yourself, I would recommend getting onto the boat earlier rather than later so that you can set up your hammock in an ideal spot, and there are definitely better places than others. For example, you might want to or not want to set up your hammock close to a large group of people who party, drink and play music into the night. You may want to consider whether you are placed closer or further away from families with young children who might cry through the night. Just things to consider. There are air conditioners on board, however, the windows were open most of the time, so they didn't really have much of an effect. However, if that's important to you and you have committed to taking the trip in a hammock, you might want to get there early so that your hammock is placed directly underneath one of the air conditioners. You might feel something there. Also at the back of the boat, there is an open air section, which is where smoking is allowed. It's noisier there. However, if it's important to you to be able to smoke whilst in your hammock, then that's the place where you'd want to be set up. There are 2 levels of hammocks on the boat, the 1st level and the 2nd level. I found the 2nd level to be a bit better. It was just a bit lighter, a bit breezier, a bit less crowded. The 1st level did seem to be very crowded from the very beginning. 2nd level is probably slightly more secure as well, because 1st floor is almost face to face with the hawkers at the docks when you pull into ports along the river. Speaking of security, I kept my backpack strapped to some wooden pallets that were on the floor directly behind the head of my hammock. That functioned in 2 ways. One was to keep my main backpack secure, but secondly, those wooden pallets, and I didn't see them throughout the entire deck, so another reason perhaps to get there early. Those wooden pallets actually lifted my backpack just off the floor just a little bit, which was important because as we were traveling through a rainforest, it would rain sometimes, and sometimes the water would come into the cabin and pool on the floor, and that would keep my bag dry. Other than that, all of my valuables, I would keep it in my day pack, which I kept with me at almost all times. And while I was sleeping, I would cradle it, like so. Other advice that I can offer is to make friends with the people around you. Generally, people tend to be nice and honest, and it does tend to be a situation where it's like, I'll look out for you if you look out for me. And so, if you do have things that are semi-valuable, or even just like the clothes in your bag, in the backpack, for example, If you know the people who are on the boat next to you and you strike up a conversation and become friends, then they're much more likely to keep at least a cautionary eye on it if you have to get up and go to the toilet or something. If you've got anything super valuable, such as electronic gadgets, jewelry, laptop, computer, I guess, your passport, keep that with you in a small bag at all times. I spent some time walking around the ship, and Ricardo got his photo taken in Manaus, and then finally it was time to pull out. This moment was really exciting because it really felt like my Amazon adventure was truly beginning. As we pulled away and said farewell to Manaus, I wasn't really sure what to expect. It felt like venturing into the unknown. That feeling really captured how Brazil felt to me in general. Mexico was new. Colombia felt familiar because I knew so many people there. But Brazil was different. I didn't know that much about Brazil before I went there, and I didn't have that many expectations. So this really felt like the beginning of a solo backpacking trip. Brazil is huge, and as I mentioned before, I don't really speak Portuguese. So this was really the beginning of a huge adventure, and I was so ready for it. About 10 minutes out of Manaus, the first thing to really pique my interest was the confluence of two different sections of the Amazon, one with lighter colored water and one with much darker water, both affected by the sediment carried in their respective parts of the river. After that, I headed down to the galley to see what was on offer for lunch. And the options were very simple. Lunch was offered between 12 and 2 p.m. daily, and you got noodles, beans, salad, and then a choice of protein, either chicken, beef, or fish. The first meal I went for chicken. It wasn't bad, but that was all I had to choose from for lunch and dinner for 4 days, so it did get old pretty quickly. And after that, I headed back to my hammock and set about doing something that I had been really looking forward to doing and that I hadn't really done since I was on the Caribbean, either in Colombia or in Mexico, and that is absolutely nothing. I think a lot of people would have found this very boring, and even a couple of other travelers on the boat, they were sort of considering maybe getting off at a port a bit earlier to speed up their trip because they were finding the boat journey quite long and tedious. However, after the intensity of Colombia, I was so here for it. You know, Colombia for me was constant interaction, whether it was with people or festivals or whatever, and this was the complete opposite, and it was complete bliss. It's not that Brazil is any less intense as a country, but it's just that this was my opportunity to really unwind. I plugged in my headphones, I read a book, I listened to music, and that was it. Before I left Australia, I had told people that my plan was to get lost in South America for 1 year, and this was really the epitome of it. It was happening. The couple in the hammocks next to me were a couple of dinks from Sao Paulo who were up there for a holiday. When they discovered that I had lost my phone charger, they offered me a spare one that they had, but then they insisted that I keep it. Random generosity of strangers. I don't know where my phone charger actually ended up. I did contact the manager of the Airbnb that I had been staying in Manaus, and he told me that he couldn't see it there, and that it sort of gave me a word of warning to be careful on the boat because it might have been stolen. However, knowing myself, this is something that I probably would have dropped on the road somewhere between the Airbnb and the dock in Manaus. I mean, you know, that is something I would do. I also bumped into a couple of young guys who were much more interested in me than I was in them. I never really found out where they were from, but they were Brazilian, and they seemed very impressed that a foreigner was on the boat, although I was not the only foreigner, but anyway, they seemed very impressed that I was there. And we used Google Translate to figure out what we were saying to each other. They kept asking me questions. They eventually decided that they had figured out why I was on the boat and in Brazil. And in their words, through Google Translate and through gestures, they had told me that basically I was an old adventurer on the hunt for Puseta. No. That night I went up to the bar on the top deck, and from there I could see that we were passing a fairly major looking town. I noticed the ship's captain pointing a spotlight into the river, and it turned out that someone from the town had brought their boat up alongside ours to load and unload supplies without us needing to dock. After that, I headed back to my hammock and we sailed on into the night.
Time to sleep. It's 11 o'clock. Good night from the boat. Okay, just woken up. And I think it is time for some breakfast.
The next morning, we docked at a river port. This was really exciting because this was really the first experience that I had on the boat up until that point of sort of meeting and having an encounter with these communities that live along the riverside. Vendors from the town rushed down to greet the boat, shouting up to the passengers and selling their goods. They were advertising everything from icy poles made from fresh fruit juice to freshly cut fruit and slices of homemade cake. They would take the money using this improvised container made from the bottom of a plastic soft drink bottle attached to a long stick. The passenger would drop the money in, and then the vendor would place the goods inside and lift it up to deck level so the customer could grab it. While we were docked, other vendors rushed onto the ship and did laps of the boat, making sure that they could sell as much as they could before disembarking before it was time to depart. We continued on and pulled into another river port further along. By then, it was early afternoon, and at that stop, a group of commandos boarded the boat. In a place like the Amazon, which cuts through such a vast remote region, it's very difficult to monitor who and what is moving along the river. As a result, boats, buses, and other forms of transport are subject to inspections to make sure everything is legitimate. People have asked me if I was worried at that moment and have told me that apparently the Brazilian police have quite a reputation. However, everyone on the boat was just sort of looking on quite calmly, and I certainly had nothing to worry about or hide. So I wasn't worried. I just took my cues from everyone else around me.
So I went down for lunch earlier. Oh, there's someone's foot. So we went down for lunch earlier, and I found that the restaurant was closed, or the galley was closed, and so I went upstairs to the bar on the rooftop, and they informed me that we had in fact moved forward one time zone. So the lunch is served from 11 until 1, and I thought I was there at the restaurant, or at the galley. I keep calling it a restaurant. It's kind of fanciful. It's a galley. I was there at 12:30. Well, I thought it was 12:30, but it was actually 1:30. So in the end I had to get a sandwich from up on the rooftop, and now I'm just waiting for dinner, which thankfully, because of the time zone difference, is going to happen 1 hour earlier than I had thought, so that's not so bad, I guess.
After that stop, we continued on, and it was on that part of the river that we started to see some of the large container ships passing us. And it was a beautiful day. It hadn't rained much that day at all, and so I spent most of it up on the top deck. It was up on the deck that I met Ken, an intrepid Scottish traveller with a particular interest in wildlife and conservation. We sat up there on the deck throughout the afternoon and the evening, chatting about life, the world, and the travels that we had been on. As night fell, the lights of Santarém, the major intermediate stop on this journey, came into view. We pulled in and docked there just in time for an incredible rainstorm to hit. The friendly couple from Sao Paulo that were staying next to me got off here, and they were taking a couple of days at the beautiful holiday town on the side of the Amazon River called Alta del Chao. When I woke up the next morning, almost everyone on my deck had changed. We were heading onwards from Santarém to Belém with an almost completely new cohort of travelers. So it's day 3, and I've just woken up on the boat, and we are still docked at Santarém. So now we are about to check out the toilets on the boat, and I would say prepare yourself, because if you're eating while watching this, now might be a good time to look away because it ain't pretty. What did I tell you? So this is the bathroom, obviously, and everything's leaking a bit, but this is the shower. There is, of course, the handle, like the thing for the shower is actually on the roof, which is interesting. The whole thing smells like river water. And then if we come around here, there are toilets, but the toilets are pretty dire. I'm not even going to open that there actually, but I will say though that the toilets do not use fresh water to flush, they use river water to flush. So if you were to look into that, actually maybe I should open it, if you were to look into that, it looks like that, but that's just because of the river water. It has been flushed, but no, it isn't clean. I think I just saw a cockroach or something walk through there, so no, it's not clean, but it will do, or it will have to do. The third day of the trip was probably the most diverse in terms of scenery. Earlier in the day, we passed stretches of shoreline that had clearly been cleared and logged, with large numbers of cows grazing there. Of course, cows aren't native to the Amazon, but they're here because this land is being used as prime grazing territory. It was a stark reminder of how altered the edges of the Amazon River already are, and just how much of it has been lost. It was also a stark reminder of just how different the Amazon River actually is to the image that exists in many people's imaginations. Yes, there are areas of dense rainforest. However, this stretch of river felt more like an aquatic highway cutting through farmland. I was traveling through agricultural land rather than pristine jungle. A little further along, the river widened dramatically. At that point, I was told that the width of the river at that location was about 2 kilometers across, and at times we couldn't even see the opposite shoreline. It really did feel more like a sea than a river. It was on this day that I had befriended Ney, a Brazilian who was on a similar South American odyssey to me. He was also traveling clockwise around the continent and was on his way back into Brazil before eventually returning home to Sao Paulo. Later, we approached a town that required the boat to leave the main river and travel along a narrow side inlet, traveling 1 or 2 kilometers upstream to reach it. The town itself looked quite quaint and peaceful. While we were there, the rain began absolutely hammering down, and we watched as a man scrambled to climb into his boat and frantically bail water out to stop it from sinking. Everyone on deck was watching as it unfolded. On the way back out of the town, we passed some logging yards on the riverfront, and that was particularly confronting because we know that this happens in the Amazon, deforestation, logging generally, but to actually see it right there and juxtaposed with the river directly in front of it, it sort of illustrated it and brought it home in a way that I really wasn't prepared for. The third day was also the wettest day of my trip along the river. Another huge dark storm rolled through, and it eventually passed, and I watched it all from the rooftop bar as night fell over the river. On the fourth day, we woke up and it was still raining. However, this time at least the riverbanks were much closer. This was where we were approaching the mouth of the Amazon. Belém isn't exactly right at the mouth of the river. It sits within a vast delta, threaded with channels and canals that cut across the landscape. The boat uses these channels to access Belém rather than having to go via the Atlantic Ocean. As you move through these channels, you actually get incredibly close to the actual rainforest itself. Scenery-wise, this was easily the most interesting part of the entire trip. As we passed near settlements along the river, people on the boat began throwing parcels of food and supplies into the water for local residents to collect. People would jump into canoes or speedboats and try and keep pace with the ferry, pulling alongside to retrieve these waterproof packages. At first, it seems quite cute and charming and traditional. However, when you realize the reality of what you're witnessing, it's actually heartbreaking. Seeing the contrast between my own privilege and the rest of us on that boat, standing on a large river ferry as a traveler by choice, and the people below in small boats relying on supplies thrown into the river, it really stays with you. Some people would even attach their boats to ours and get a tow along so they could jump up onto the ferry, often letting their children climb aboard to try and sell their wares as we went. Other villages we passed were very small, sometimes just 1 or 2 houses sitting along the riverbank, and as the boat went past, people would come out and wave to us. Other villages were a lot bigger, and in those cases there would often be several speedboats coming out to greet the ferry. The rain on that day was on and off, and we got some really good views of the dense jungle along the riverbanks. We passed fires along the shoreline too, which I think were probably scrap heap fires. Later that day we pulled into another town to dock, one of the last stops of the journey, Breves.
What has brought this on, but ever since we arrived like just in front of Breves, there are all these moths in the air. It's like they're everywhere. Look. So weird. Gross.
After pulling out of Breves, we settled in for our final night on the river.
So this is now the end of day 4 on the boat. It's about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and it's starting to get a bit old. I have a pretty, I'm pretty patient, but today is the day, well not today actually, this afternoon has been the afternoon where it's a bit like, okay, I think we're done here. But I mean, it's not bad, I'm not bored, I've certainly got a lot to do. So we are supposed to be in Belém tomorrow at some time, so tomorrow night I believe. But looking at the map, I don't quite understand how that is going to be unless we stop somewhere and dock somewhere for the night. But I mean, and that may well happen. But if not, then it looks like we could be in Belém earlier. We could be there tomorrow morning sometime. But then I don't know what this journey has in store for me in the next couple of hours. So let's see.
The skies cleared just enough for us to see the moon. The next morning there was a real sense of anticipation as we navigated through the final channels of the delta and began to approach the city of Belém. We came around one bend in the river and suddenly there they were, skyscrapers. After 4 days on the river, skyscrapers greeting us at one of the most important cities in northern Brazil. We were emerging from the Amazon to the developed world once again. And then it was time to say goodbye to the place that had been my home for the past 96 hours on the boat. I gave my hammock to a local family on the boat that Ken and I had befriended, and they seemed quite happy with that. Ney and I decided that in Belém we would stay at the same hostel because he was about to begin a volunteer position there and I needed a place to sleep for just one night. I was also very fortunate, Ney, thank you, that I didn't need to deal with the taxi touts at the Belém port because I had befriended a Brazilian Portuguese speaker. So we got into a taxi and without being ripped off, made our way into the center of Belém. Belém is simply gorgeous. It's often referred to as the tropical Paris or the Paris of the tropics, and when you walk around the city, it's easy to see why. It was originally colonized by the French before being taken over by the Portuguese, and it's home to a huge amount of beautiful old architecture, grand cathedrals, old mansions, some of which have been turned into museums. And a lovely garden that contains a small zoo, where I finally saw a toucan and a capybara, two things that I hadn't seen while traveling along the Amazon itself. Ney also tracked down a really good Brazilian barbecue restaurant, and oh my god, this was the best meal that I had ever eaten. After 4 days of eating from the galley on the boat, to finally have like real food, grilled steak, farofa, which is a type of toasted cassava meal, and açaí. I can still taste it today. When we were walking through a park in Belém that day, Ney also insisted that I try coxinha, which is a type of Brazilian samosa, is probably the easiest way to explain it, but it's like a samosa with the potato on the outside. It was my first experience with true Brazilian cuisine, and I was in love. This was the gateway to a whole new world of culinary experiences for me. While I was in Belém, there was another huge tropical downpour, which we managed to escape by running into a fairly upmarket riverfront dining and entertainment precinct. And then after that, I hit the sack for the night. I had really packed into one day as much as I could from this beautiful northern Brazilian city. I really wish that I had been able to spend longer in Belém because I was really enjoying it. However, I had kind of misjudged the number of days and nights that I would be spending on the boat. And the next morning, after arriving in Belém, I had a flight out of the city to somewhere else in the northeast of Brazil. To find out where that is, make sure that you tune in again next time on Latin America Diaries.